Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellie Danavi. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Race and Culture. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. We are gathered here today to mark the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. This is the day that the police in Sharpeville, South Africa, opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid in 1960. In 1979, the UN General Assembly decided to organize an annual week of solidarity with peoples struggling against racism and racial discrimination, beginning on March 21st. The apartheid system in South Africa was dismantled in the early 1990s, but racism and racial discrimination is still a reality. And here in North America, the lives of Indigenous, Black, Asian, and other racialized communities are affected by systemic, organizational, and interpersonal racism. My colleagues and I here at the Center for Race and Culture are joining from Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders, past and present, who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of our responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all people. So today we have organized different sessions for you, and you can, for those of you who registered and you're here, you've seen the program outline and the details, but this is just a quick review. As you can see, we have short breaks between the sessions. Also keep in mind that the chat box is disabled, but you can use the Q&A if you have any questions for us throughout the program. I'm just going to pause here for you to quickly review the program. Before we start the roundtable, we will do a quick poll here to have a better understanding of our audience. Please take the time to answer these demographic questions. We will give you a minute and appreciate your participation. Okay, thank you so much. So we start the event today with the roundtable, how to build a collective capacity to achieve racial equity. Allow me to introduce and welcome our panelists. Jennifer Long is an assistant professor in cultural anthropology at MacEwan University. She teaches courses on race and racism, anthropological theory and methods, and design anthropology. Her research includes whiteness, newcomer settlement and integration, racism, and national belonging. She has conducted field work in the Netherlands and Canada. We have Kyle Muzyka, Métis and Cree journalist from Treaty 8, currently an associate producer with CBC Unreserved. He has worked at CBC for more than 5 years, including for the National Indigenous Unit and locally for Edmonton and Yellowknife. And we have Irfan Chaudhry, the director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity and Equity at MacEwan University. And in this capacity, he leads the development of human rights, diversity and equity initiatives within the institution. Irfan has a bachelor's degree in sociology and master's in criminal justice from the University of Alberta. Welcome to our roundtable, everyone. It's great to have you here. And let me start. So the way we want to have this session is that I will have some general questions for all of you, and then some specific questions for each of you. Let me start with a more general question. And if that's okay, let's start with Kyle. And then I will ask Irfan and Jennifer. So when we hear about racially motivated hate crimes or hate incidents, police brutality against Black folks, or overt racist incidents from the States, a common response that I've noticed here in Canada is, thank God, you know, we Canadians are different. Racism is an issue south of the border, but not here. This is a rhetoric that we hear from average Canadians as well as politicians. What is your response to such statements, and why is it important to address and challenge them? Kyle?
Danase, everybody. Kananis going through for the time. Really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on the program. Yeah, I mean, I think if you would have asked me this question a couple of years ago, I think I would have had a little bit of sympathy in regards to, you know, maybe folks just don't really understand the racial realities that people experience here. But I just have a really hard time believing that really anybody could see what has been happening in our community, you know, specifically to Black Muslim women recently, but also in Canada's entire history of colonialism and genocide of Indigenous people. Sorry, I've got a dog in the background if she makes a little bit of an appearance. My family, my kokam, she went to residential school. You know, her family before that lived in tents. You know, we have cousins, folks who live on reserves, you know, in northern Alberta, and you know, there's just so much colonial history that I feel like I could take up the whole hour talking about, but I won't. But I could, but I won't. But what, you know, we take reserves for example. Indigenous people were deliberately pushed into less favorable lands from lands like Edmonton, like Calgary, where you know, rivers flow, you know, the land is really, really generous here. And we're pushed deliberately into not so generous areas. And, you know, the fact that Indigenous people continue to make it work, I think is one of the many signs of resiliency. But I think it's really important to understand, like I don't really think there's any way that you could possibly say that, you know, racism doesn't exist or exists to a lesser extent here, after examining the colonial history and, you know, consistent and persistent genocide of Indigenous people all the way till today. You know, and I'll leave it at that, but just to say that, you know, Indigenous people are not obviously the only folks who experience racism here. And, you know, we've seen, as I mentioned off the top, plenty of recent examples to suggest that.
Thank you, Kyle. Let's go to Jennifer.
I was fully waiting for Irfan to go next, so I thought I had a little bit of time. So just to build on what Kyle was saying, and thank you, I guess the first thing I want to say is thank you very much for having me here today. It's a big privilege for me to be here and speaking with some other folks that you have scheduled for today and on this panel here. What I wanted to say was the work that I'm doing right now. So as you mentioned, I'm doing research on whiteness. And what Kyle was just saying is that I think this idea narrative persists that, you know, we're better than the US. So starting last summer, and it's continuing to go even until this summer, is that I've been collecting data with the help of a great research team based here in Edmonton around, you know, just this question, you know, how do you think Canadian or US racism and whiteness is different from each other? And so some of the answers that I've received from the participants that took part in this research are, you know, Canadians tend to ignore the racism, or they think it's more subtle than it is in the US. And then, you know, there's contrasting ideas such as, you know, it's more overt racism here in the US, but they think it's louder in the US because there's more perhaps talk or conversation around it. And I think that kind of helps us understand how very uncomfortable perhaps white folks are around having discussions around white racial identity or racism. People tended to talk about how they thought that, you know, Canadians were innocent, that they weren't willing to recognize their history, racist history, you know, in terms of genocide and colonialism. And also, I asked questions particularly about whether they thought Alberta was different from other provinces or territories in terms of how it dealt with or thought about or enacted racism. And I thought one of the really interesting responses that I received was this idea that Albertans associate themselves with working hard, which then connects with this idea of meritocracy. So I would say, and just so that we're all on the same, you know, for folks out there, in case it's the first time they're hearing that, I define what meritocracy as the belief that a narrative, it's a narrative that success is measured by individual achievements and efforts. And this approach ignores the powerful role of social class or racism. But in so doing, what they were trying to connect is that the only racism that's out there directed towards particular people is an association of how hard others work and the perception that white folks work hard to get what they earn. And so it's this idea, and I think Canadians definitely still have this perception that they're better than the US, and it's complicated in a number of ways. And I think there's a large ignorance, lack of discussion, and lack of, you know, recognition around the privilege that white folks have. And I'm going to leave off with one idea, and that's there's certain things that the US does better around addressing racism than Canadians do. And I think that's, you know, they collect some race-based data, which we don't do here as much as we do here in Canada. And that's where I'll leave it. I'll let Irfan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Irfan.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jennifer and Kyle for your comments, and Eli, thanks so much for inviting us today. You know, I think, you know, when I reflect on that question, I reflect on kind of what Jennifer and Kyle had shared. You know, one common thread that I think I would like to pick up off is the historical legacy that I think we tend to downplay here in Canada. I think we do a terrible job in Canada around educating, you know, not just, you know, kids in the school system, but even at universities, for example, when you're teaching like a 200 or 300 level course, and it's the first time a student is coming across the concept of residential schools, or it's the first time they're learning about, you know, the Canada had slavery as well. Or it's the first time they're learning about the Japanese head tax. And, you know, when we kind of have to reintroduce these topics at a post-secondary level, I think it's important to be able to reflect and you know, further inform and educate folks, but it shouldn't take that long in our education system to get there. And so that historical erasure of our own connection to racial discrimination in Canada is, you know, this is systemic racism in action, right? We're willfully trying to not have this information in various educational settings, that it's doing a huge disservice to our community. And when we go back to that broader question you asked around, you know, thank God we Canadians are different, you know, we just try to sweep it under the rug, right? The second you know, in various roles I've had, the second you're trying to talk about racism, people just backpedal away from you, right? I had a recent example where we received some funds to address racial discrimination in hockey, because of kind of those broader narratives that are out there. And it was really interesting to see a significant shift prior to the spring and summer of last year, when I was looking for, you know, partners to provide letters of support in a hockey context. I was met with silence, or I was met with very broad emails saying, "Oh no, it's not an issue. We got it covered." You know, yada yada yada. The second the George Floyd, killing happened, and you had a reemergence of, you know, anti-racism being connected to various sectors, the amount of people that again reached out saying, well, maybe we can provide you a letter of support, or maybe we can do this, or maybe we can do that. I think that to me kind of highlights, we don't need to wait for a tragedy to get people to start talking about racism or start taking racial discrimination seriously. And I think, you know, the last thing I'll share is, when we start to always piggyback off of, well, we're not the States, we're willfully ignoring our own issues that we have here. And, you know, Kyle, raised some very, very unfortunate recent examples that continue to pop up, not only just in Edmonton, but in our province. Calgary over the weekend had a very similar crime occur against a Muslim woman who had her hijab torn off. So I think these are pieces like how much more evidence do we need to highlight that racial discrimination is still a real pressing issue in Canada? And I'll kind of leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irfan. Jennifer, you mentioned whiteness and white identity here in Canada. Can you talk a bit more about that, the role of whiteness in everyday life here in Canada? What is whiteness, white identity? And I've seen this discomfort, among white folks using the term white, right? I've noticed that more people are using the term Caucasian. And here in the center, we talk about the fact that we talk about the problem with the terminology and we explain the history. But my question is, what is whiteness if white Canadians don't identify with it?
Thank you. And it's really, it's not interesting. I think it's a fact that the majority of the time when white folks think about a white collective identity, they're assuming that they have to be a white pride or a white nationalist movement, that it has to be overtly racist. And this is not what whiteness is. So as an anthropologist, I tend to turn to other anthropologists like John Hartigan Jr., who talks about whiteness being two things. Number one, white privilege, which I think we're going to talk about a little later. And number two, the tendency for white folks to really disavow the very notion of a white collective identity. And so if we're going to focus on that, it's an unmarked identity. So this means that white folks don't tend to ascribe to it. And what really came out from some of the research that I've been doing is this idea that there was what Irfan was talking about, an awakening among white folks to recognize in response to the murder of George Floyd, that, and from that point, the Black Lives Matter movement, that white identity was something that they had to kind of deal with or think about. And so up until this point, they had discussed a general avoidance of the topic, which is a racial privilege in and of itself. So for example, one person stated, we don't just sit around the dinner table and talk about being white. And so these folks would also speak to the idea that while there was good intentions held by white folks, that conversations were often shut down because it was thought if they talked about race, then they were being racist. Now we know this is like a colorblind racism approach, and that, this perception that it actually, what it ends up doing is avoiding issues of racism, and in certain circumstances can create, an invalidation of racialized individuals' experiences with racism. And so I think it's important that we understand how this white identity is ignored, or, people don't want to be associated with it, but it works as we need to recognize it as, as something that is often, for example, associated with a typical Canadian or an American identity. And you can see this when people are asked the question, yeah, but where are you really from? When people who, and this is a generalizing term, so I want to, problematize it, but if there's a non-white person, somebody would say, but where are you really from? That carries with it the assumption that Canadian people are white people. And so I guess I want to, connecting this back to the histories that we've been talking about, that this idea of white identity here in Canada has a connection to Europeanness, maybe culturally Christian values. And it's often depicted as, and I mean this in terms of the stories that we hear about it from the media or the news, or, beyond that in our school books, it's portrayed as being more progressive or more equitable or more global. And I think we have to recognize the ways in which these ideas come from, racist science that was originally used to justify colonialism and imperialism. So I just want to, one more point and then I'll stop talking, but this idea that whiteness is not uniformly understood. It's something that's within Canadian culture, the values and the norms, and that this meaning of whiteness can change over time, and it means different things in different places. But just like white privilege, whiteness, these white identities are also shaped by our class, our gender, our sex, ethnicity, age, sexuality, and other kinds of identities. And that this is something that, when we think about its importance here in Canada, in order for us to start addressing the white privilege that comes with whiteness, we have to start recognizing it for the racial advantage that it gives in order to address it and create a more equitable society.
Thank you so much for that. That was a specific question for you, but Irfan and Kyle, is there anything you want to add to that? do you have any thoughts you would like to share?
Briefly, that Irfan touched on this as well, but the idea that folks are, when it comes to racial inequities, they're often reactionary. So they often are responding to a particular event. And I think in this case, we talked about George Floyd's murder. As a catalyst for many of the things that Irfan was talking about regarding, folks, well, maybe we can write a letter now. I think that is something that's really important to highlight, is that most folks are, they tend to be reactionary instead of, trying to fix the problem, before it gets, so big that, they're consumed by it. So just really wanted to touch on that, because Jennifer touched on it as well. I just really wanted to highlight that importance.
Thank you for that. Irfan, I have a question for you. As we continue these important conversations about racism, discrimination, and hate, there is serious backlash that is rooted in fear and xenophobia. Social media has made it kind of easier for us to connect and share our opinions, but at the same time, we see increasingly, more hate-filled posts, comments, Facebook pages, and there's, and the notion of freedom of expression comes up, right? That you can't silence us. This is our right to express our ideas. And can you tell us more about freedom of expression in Canada and the limits to it?
Yeah, sure. How much time do I have? I want to make sure I don't go.
I would say 5-6 minutes would be
okay.
great.
I will do my best, because I have a lot of considerations for people to maybe keep in mind. I think the first thing I always like to share is, freedom of speech and freedom of expression does not mean freedom from accountability, right? So I often find it really interesting when people do kind of throw that right out there, which all of us have that as a protected right under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be any accountability had. And it's really interesting because when you do see some of these comments on, let's say, social media posts where someone gets called out for being, overtly or most of the time, covertly racist, people will just default to freedom of expression, right? But I think we have to see the impact of some of those terms, the language utilized on some of the posts. Social media platforms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Twitter, whether it's TikTok, which I don't use, so I have no idea, outside of just downloading on my phone, it's just sitting there. But they've got a lot better at, providing spaces for moderating this content, utilizing even algorithms to remove like overt terms. They're pretty savvy at that. But it's those subtle forms of, the cloaked racism that some people might term it as. It's those subtle slights that, if you look at it in face value, the comment itself isn't necessarily hateful or racist, but in the context of the comment, it 100% should be framed as such or viewed as such. And in that regard, that's where we have that freedom of expression, in the context of a university, academic freedom, parliamentary freedoms out there too. But it doesn't mean freedom from accountability, right? So I often try to share this in terms of, we have the various, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Bill of Rights, and then we have the criminal code that does outline various parameters that if they are breached, then, criminal code can, tap into whether it's hate speech or hate propaganda. But it goes even beyond that, right? Because I think when you even look at how our laws have been established, our hate crime laws came into effect in the 60s and 70s as a result of the Cohen Commission. Cohen Commission was a committee that was put together to kind of articulate the need for hate-related laws in response to World War II and the atrocities that happened as a result of genocide. So when you look at our laws and the evolution, they're very historically connected, but also quite antiquated in terms of what we have right now. It wasn't until the mid-1990s when you had sentencing principles added on to, Section 718I2AI. I have it tattooed on my arm, but that's the one that provides sentencing principles for consideration. But it's 2021. Our laws weren't looked at in any meaningful way from the federal level around hate since the 1990s. And it goes back to looking at how we look at it as kind of like a Venn diagram where we have free speech on one hand, we have hate speech on the other hand, and tying in everything together is social values. What are we looking at right now in terms of our social values? Are we having more emphasis being placed on freedom of expression, Or do we want more emphasis placed on protection around hate speech as it might relate to freedom of expression? And I think we're seeing momentum being placed right now quite strongly around more people wanting measures in place to protect from hateful narratives and hateful speech that we know don't hit the threshold of the criminal code. But a conversation I've been having over the last number of months, 100% understand where that default response is coming from. What about provincial? What about municipal? If we know our criminal code can address some of the nuances that's really prevalent around hate speech, and I'm talking more so around the overt forms now that you see publicly versus the subtle ones that you still can report on Facebook, but they don't get reported as much success rate because they don't violate the terms of services of this various platform. So, all of the folks who are listening, if you've ever tried to even report something hateful or derogatory that you've seen on a social media platform, you've seen that they have a mechanism in place, but oftentimes you aren't informed if you were successful in getting that report removed, or you sometimes get a default response saying, this might not reach a breach of our terms of service. However, you can block the user, or you can do this, you can do that. And I think it's individualizing an issue of responsibly allowing us to utilize those platforms, but it misses that broader aspect around how much harm there still is as it relates to freedom of expression and the nuances of hate speech connected to that I think we've been quite clearly showcased and outlined that our laws are not set up well to deal with our current context because of how antiquated they are in some regard. So that's my short answer to that question.
Thank you, Irfan. Kyle and Jennifer, is there anything you want to add there? Any thoughts? Okay, I have a question for you, Kyle. Talking about the media, we talked about the social media, but let's talk specifically about the media. What is the role of the media in achieving racial equity, or at this time of anti-racism movements? And what is our role as consumers, possibly to hold them accountable?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question off the top, I think our role is massive, because media is one of the main perpetrators of a lot of these stereotypes and problems to begin with. I really think that media has a great ability to hold certain organizations accountable for their actions. So whether that's government or police or whatever, but we hardly ever look within, and we hardly ever hold ourselves accountable. And so, speaking specifically to Indigenous communities, media has routinely helicoptered into communities and taken stories, become story takers and helicoptered out with no real regard for harm reduction and no real regard for really ensuring that folks aren't worse off than when they went into the communities. We're really, really good at telling all the really awful stories about communities, and not so much, about the positive things that happen in communities as well. So what, and I'll ask a rhetorical question, what do you think that does to the perceptions of that community from folks who are outside of it? So, we really have to look internally in terms of, addressing and acknowledging our role that media has played in, in I guess, perpetuating these stereotypes, but also understand what our role is going forward. Acknowledgement's the first step, but we really have to make sure that, we continue to have empathy and we continue to tell stories that are accurate representations of communities, specifically marginalized communities. In regards to what, the average consumer can do, it's really tough, because it's just like any big institution, in that it's really hard to infiltrate if you're not a member of said institution. Because even as somebody who works in the media, I find it impossible to change things with any sort of speed. But in terms of what the average person can do, it can be really valuable to just call stuff out when you see it. CBC had made a mistake last week where we had used a like a stock photo of an Asian woman for a COVID-19 story, which, you know, might seem innocent at the start, but with all of the, you know, anti-Asian hate that has been happening very recently, that can perpetuate stereotypes. So we just have to be really careful and mindful of all of that stuff. And you know, I think it's going to take some practice. I think it's going to take some folks retiring, frankly, in order to really get those changes. But I really think, you know, the only reason why folks on the desk, as I hadn't seen it prior, but the only reason why folks on the desk knew about this is because somebody called it out. And so that stuff can be really valuable. You know, I hate to say this, but, you know, government's the same way in that, like, you can send them an email and it might not work, but often posting on social media is a better way to get your response. And, you know, unfortunately, public shaming is sort of the swiftest way these days, which is kind of interesting. And I think too, you know, there are some smaller media orgs in specific that I think are doing some really good work. You know, like the TIE or the Discourse, or, you know, even APTN, for example, some organizations that are doing work, like, make sure that you try to support them when you can. And then, you know, for the folks who are working in bigger, you know, legacy corps, like, you know, CBC is a good example, or Post Media, you know, obviously the organization itself probably doesn't have a great track record, but I think it's really important to support the folks who you think are doing good work. And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily that, you know, but I think there are lots of examples of folks within the CBC who do have empathy with their work and are trying to you know, ensure that marginalized voices are heard and respected and empathized with. So it doesn't really seem like much, but a lot of that support can go a long way for folks.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Irfan, Jennifer, is there anything you want to add there about the responsibility, the role of the media, or how we as consumers can hold them accountable? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind just adding on to one thing Kyle had mentioned, because I think you know, that frame of reference where people are looking for accountability, and I think accuracy in representation in media stories. And so even the example raised of, if you're calling, you know, someone out in a respectful way for the most part, because you want them to be aware of it, that also kind of highlights, you know, the challenge around, you know, mechanisms in place to report this, you know, or raise awareness to it in, let's say, you know, appropriate ways. Because oftentimes, you know, if you do send an email to an editor, you don't know if it's going to get any response at all, right? But unfortunately, the way, you know, we're set up now on social media, you know, if you tag an institution in a tweet and get some good traction behind that tweet, like, I don't know if anyone's following right now what's happening with, like, Cinnamon Toast Crunch and shrimp. And if you have no idea what that is, just go Google it, because this is kind of the example in action, where when you try to go and address something in the, you know, corporate approved way, and you get zero traction, well, now you sometimes have to make it more visible in public, and guess what? Now you get a lot of traction. And so I think that's always a good reminder that if we have these appropriate systems in place where you can, you know, help people be aware of some of those, you know, unconscious biases, that could be an example with, you know, the image and the headline being utilized here, then people wouldn't need to feel to have to go on social media and, you know, name and shame because they weren't getting a response. And it goes back to how we even look at addressing racism in and of itself, right? Oftentimes it's downplayed. Oftentimes it's like, you know, maybe you look too much into it. And I would love us to start shifting that narrative and saying, no, I believe you. You know, I might not have experienced it myself, but I totally believe you, right? Versus saying, you know, you had a bad day, as we've seen with, you know, the unfortunate aftermath of the Georgia shooting in the US. And so I just wanted to kind of echo what Kyle was saying, right? I think if we have mechanisms in place that allow us as a collective to want to have information consumed in a responsible and respectful way, we should have those mechanisms in place to raise awareness appropriately. Otherwise, yeah, you are going to see another campaign on social media come through, and, you know, that's another aspect as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, referring to those recent examples, you know, the police coming in and saying, you know, the person had a bad day. So that's, or some other examples, like I was looking at some news articles last week, and I thought, oh my God, this is exactly the idea of white privilege, right? And I want to kind of use that and go back to Jennifer. Jennifer, you talked about white identity a little bit. You briefly mentioned white privilege, but can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. Yes, I can. And it's funny because I feel like I'm being very, I'm approaching this a bit more. I teach courses like race and racism. So sometimes I want to get the definitions out there, and I'm trying to fight myself on it, but I don't think I can. So anyway, let me just define it for you. So I'm going back to that same anthropologist, Hartigan Jr. He defines white privilege as an array of advantages that accrue to white folks, regardless of whether, as individuals, they maintain any kind of racist beliefs. So white privilege is most manifest. So it comes about in ways that white folks are generally able to maintain an unmarked racial identity. So this means that white privilege is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled. And it's not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. White privilege is both unconsciously enjoyed and consciously perpetuated. And we enjoy these privileges in 3 ways, according to a really great article by Corey Collins, who talks about white privilege as the power of the norm, the power of the benefit of the doubt, and the power of accumulated power. And this all builds off of, and I've seen some of this in the Q&A section there, the work of Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Knapsack. And this is from the 1980s. So this discourse, this dialogue has been around for quite a while now. And, for various reasons, I think it kind of comes up and people talk about it for a while. But, and of course, this has changed over time, just like whiteness does, so does white privilege. And so just to give you a couple of examples, because oftentimes, if people have experienced socioeconomic exclusion or sexism, then they tend to think, oh, I haven't experienced racial advantage. And that's just not the case. These different exclusions map on top of each other, and they compound their exclusions. And so if we're thinking about what power of the norm is, some of, and these come straight from Peggy McIntosh, I can click on my news app and see people of my, racial identity widely represented. Or when I'm told about a national heritage or about a civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. So these are kind of more, it can include things like, this is kind of your base subtle level of white privilege, where if you go into a music shop, you can count on finding music of people that represent your racial identity, or into a supermarket, you can find staple foods that fit your cultural traditions, or into a hairdresser's and find someone that can cut your hair in most places. So again, this is the subtle form where products, places, job ads are created with a particular racial identity in mind, and that's white folks here in Canada, and I would say North America as well. So I think what this does for white folks is that they, myself, that is, you kind of walk through the world with an expectation that your needs are going to be readily met, and that people of color would move through the world knowing that their needs perhaps are on the margins. And this, we need to recognize it so that we can address the gaps. And I don't want to take too long here, but there's 2 more. One's the benefit of the power of the benefit of the doubt. And so a couple of examples from Peggy McIntosh's work again was, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. Or as a white person, whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. And one that I think is really quite pertinent, I think that helps us, maybe folks here can see it in their everyday life. I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer emails without having people attribute these choices to bad morals, the poverty or illiteracy of my racial identity. So what we can take from these prompts are that white folks are more often humanized, that they're more likely to receive compassion and be granted individual potential and survive mistakes that they make. This has negative effects, of course, on people of color who, without this privilege, face the consequences of racial profiling, stereotyping, and a lack of compassion for their struggles. And just as people of color did nothing to deserve this unequal treatment, white people did not earn disproportionate access to compassion and fairness. And the final one, of course, is the final one that I think we tend to focus on is this idea of accumulated power. And this can be easily, seen as things like passing down of wealth, and this historical wealth can come in the form of money, property, possessions, and power, as in social locations and networks. And this highlights the legacy of historical systems which have not been appropriately redressed. And as white folks, and this is still according to Collins, we can ask ourselves, what do I have that I didn't earn? Or who built the system that I'm working within, and who keeps this system going? Because the work of white privilege is to perpetuate itself and to keep this inequality going. And this happens when white folks don't reflect on their own racial privilege and advantage. They don't speak up and they don't act to dismantle it. And I think there's an old adage that, I've kind of reshaped here, but it's this idea that if you don't actively work against this system, then you're part of the reason why this system continues to be in place, or something like that. So I think that's what I understand and recognize white privilege. As a white woman living in Treaty 6 territory, I'm one of the most privileged people that live in this space.
Thank you for that. Kyle and Irfan, is there anything you would like to add there? No. So, we have an initiative here at the Center for Race and Culture. It's called Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations. We do monthly roundtables. We invite community leaders, scholars, activists, right? One idea is to raise awareness, to educate the public, but also build that capacity, right? To promote advocacy, show people how to do that. And we have many engaged community members who are interested in educating ourselves about racism, about discrimination, social inclusion. And there are different programs and initiatives like the one that we have. But there's also this question from the average citizen. They want to be part of change, but they don't know how. And they say, I'm not a politician. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not in a position of power. But how can I help, right? So in order, if racial equity is a collective goal for all of us, how can we help? How can we be part of change, even when we are not in positions of, if we are not leaders in large corporations or organizations, if we are not policymakers or politicians? Do you have any suggestions based on your areas of expertise or your own experience? Let's start with Kyle here.
Sure. Yeah. I think I talked about it a little bit earlier, just regarding media, and I really think that there is a place for folks to really hold us accountable going forward. I won't reiterate that too much, but just more from a general experience. I think we sort of, we wanted to really promote the idea of explaining this type of stuff to your racist uncles and stuff like that at the dinner tables. And I hate to bring that up again, but I really think it's important that if there is anybody in your life who you feel can trust you, but also maybe has some sort of I wouldn't even say it doesn't even have to be racist beliefs, although it certainly can be, but just some misguided thoughts or some not complete understandings of the situations. It's just to take the time to explain it. I really think, and I'm sure that Irfan's got and Jennifer both have some really great ideas too, because I really think it's important to try to hit this from as many angles as possible. So it's not only explaining to people one at a time, because that would take forever, but it's also just doing a whole bunch of other stuff, making sure that you're involved in racial equality and just really be conscious of it. I think that's a really important thing too, is just to understand your place. Jennifer put all those definitions and stuff like that. It's just put so beautifully. I really think it's really important to recognize that this is not something that disqualifies a white person's struggle. It's something that it's just your reality that you were born into this. I'm an Indigenous person. My dad is white. I'm pretty white passing. I do not experience racism the same way as many of my cousins do. And so that was something that I had to reconcile with. And it's something that I work to try to understand a little bit more every single day. So it's important, I think, to really just center yourself for a second in only to understand your place, how you are affected and how you can help folks who might be affected a little bit more than you.
Thank you, Kyle. I will go to Irfan next.
Yeah, no, I think building off what Kyle just mentioned, what can everyone do? It doesn't matter what position you hold. I think the biggest piece around a lot of this work around anti-racism is starting acknowledging an issue, right? I think is really easy for us, and all of us are likely guilty of it as much as we might not want to admit, in some way, shape, or form, of how we can willfully ignore if we are witnessing or seeing anything that might be discriminatory in nature, and not knowing what to do, or willfully not acting. And there's various reasons why people may or may not act, and there's dynamics and considerations there. But I think the biggest starting point is just we host a session here at MacEwan related around anti-discrimination response, where the focus is around anti-racism specifically, and it's based off of a model from Dr. Ishu Ishiyama, who's from the University of British Columbia, who developed this a number of years back. And he has this really articulate model, 4 levels of witnessing, and how when we address something like racism, we have to shift ourselves from diswitnessing something and not acknowledging it as an issue and ignoring it as the issue, and then moving us to the last scale of his 4 levels, ethical witnessing with social action. And what that looks like is addressing something as the issue, but then also knowing those starting points to start pressing for action, right? So you might not be the CEO of a company, but you can contact the CEO of that company because you were in their store over the weekend and you witnessed a racist incident where staff didn't know how to intervene. So now me as a paying customer in the store, I want to know from you, what are you doing to empower your staff to know how to address racism in the store? And if you aren't willing to give me a real answer, I'm likely not going to be shopping at your store again, right? These are ways that we can have pressure without feeling we have to directly intervene in various ways. So I think, all of us have different comfort levels, different safety considerations when we might witness or be, the receiver of racial discrimination. And I think one of the starting points is knowing where people can turn to or where to go. So my initial, response to that question is, just knowing that we can do anything, as a starting point, even if it's just a retweet about something. That's a starting point. I find this work can get people feeling very, very uncomfortable because of our own discomfort around the concept of race. And sometimes someone wants to do the right thing, but then they hesitate because they're now worried that they're going to be called out as a racist, ironically enough, because they're now speaking out against racism, and trying to get people comfortable to know that you can be a part of the dialogue in meaningful ways, but we have to get you comfortable to do that. I think these are pieces collectively, the conversations that you are hosting, for example, provide the space for people to get comfortable. Anti-discrimination response, when we host it here, we purposely leave it as a small group because we want people to utilize that space to practice, right? It might sound really, really, basic, but sometimes people need that space to practice and dialogue a potential response because that builds confidence. And if we don't have confidence to respond, that's where silence becomes the default response. And now silence makes it seem like people are approving of racial discrimination in a public setting because no one spoke up. Speak up.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, and just to, the points that Kyle and Irfan have put forward already are so important. And I would just say that white folks, what they can do is listen to Black, Indigenous, and folks of color who have lived experiences of racism to try to understand what to do. Because I think sometimes, white folks might come into something and really want to do some great work and don't listen. As individuals who can be the ones that I think are most advantaged by systems of racism, might be trying to do more harm with good. And I appreciate what Irfan was talking about with regard to, being worried about saying anything, it might just stop them. So you want to be able to do small things, little things that get you started, and to keep working on pushing your levels of comfort from there. And so what I wanted to say was that there's lots of information already out there. It's out there on the internet and books and free online courses about what white folks and folks interested in supporting anti-racism movements can do already. And these include things like just listening, voting, bearing witness, organizing in collective action, financially supporting Black, Indigenous, and other businesses owned by Canadians of color, supporting increases in minimum wage, for example, to address poverty, push for governmental or workplace policy reform, and this is to address institutional or infrastructural racism. These are important because it helps us to understand how different and complex racism is. It's not just between two people. It's also built and baked into our systems. So we have to approach our anti-racism in the same way. And just so you know, a lot of these ideas, again, are from Ijeoma Oluo, who published their book in 2019. So this is, again, the information is out there about what we can do, but it's also about pushing our level of comfort. And I really like that idea. So Yad Jassy, who's a Ghanaian American writer, wrote an article this week for The Guardian called "White People, Black Authors Are Not Your Medicine." And in this article, she argues that white folks are reading books by authors of colors to assuage their guilt, perhaps, and ultimately limit their anti-racism action to this kind of self-contained bubble. So what I want to pull away is a sense of also of inoculation, and perhaps this is COVID talking, I don't know, but I think some white folks might, because of this discomfort, want a quick, shot to be like, okay, I'm better, I'm no longer racist. But this, we have to think about as white folks, all the ways in which we are privileged by, we receive racial advantage in ways that are conscious and unconscious, the way that we might perpetuate it through our own actions. There's a lot out there to learn, and self-reflection is key. And also when we get to a space of comfort, to recognize that while we might be, we might have identified our anti, some of the racism we have in some areas, it might be, full blown in other areas. We might be xenophobic, whereas we think we've dealt with our anti-Black racism. So this is a lifelong project. And, white folks, if you need to take a step away because it feels too uncomfortable, just make sure you take that step back. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that. We have a very good question from one of our participants, Ricardo. He says, how do we move from ethnocentric lens to a more ethno-relative lens in society? Any thoughts around that?
I mean, if we had the answer, that would be phenomenal, right? I think if we were able to kind of, provide that change. But I think it goes back to a question like that, I think needs to be framed, and from my response anyways, around how we understand the current systems, right? Because that also speaks to another question in the chat there, around unconscious bias and all races being guilty, but who perpetuated the most. And I think that's a question that needs to be answered again through a systems perspective, right? Because if we look at the way the current structure and the current system is set up as relates to privilege and power, we know where certain identities are being left behind because of policies, processes, procedures, institutions that historically have had policies that have been created to be equal to all in theory, but in practice is fairly inequitable, right? So I think when we start to address some of these pieces around, when we look at institutions and how, I'll speak from a university context, how our admissions system is really inequitable if you think about it, right? When you put in layers around different identities, when you put in other layers around, citizenship status, and how we allow some folks in with ease, but other folks, we ask for endless amounts of paperwork that might not be available because a host country may not longer have access to those documents. And so now you have someone who wants to come and study in Canada, but can't provide you with a transcript from their host institution because they're also coming from a country where that institution might not even be there anymore. Or that paper trail might not have been documented as we expect from like a Western standard, right? So I think when you talk about unconscious biases, it has to be looked at from a systems perspective. When you talk about how we can move from different lenses, from Eurocentric to ethnocentric, again, it's accessing those power and privileges that are currently at play. What makes this work really, really challenging right now, and we have this wokeness that's been reemerging everywhere. And as Jennifer was talking, it reminded me a lot about liberal racism in terms of how this work can go up to a point, because again, those decision makers tend to be from specific privileged backgrounds, and that's how this work either elevates or gets stalled, right? So I even think about right now around the reemergence of an interest in anti-racism, where more sectors and more, let's say, companies or institutions have been able to have more traction, is when they have diversity of viewpoints, let's say on their board or at the leadership levels. But you often do see this work get stalled when you have homogenous people of certain demographics still holding the power, speak to liberal racism that says, yes, we can do this, but whoa, if we really have to make this change, we can't do that. Oh, what do you mean we got to collect race-based data so we can ensure we're reflective of our community in our leadership positions? We don't want to do that. We just hire for the best fit possible. Knowing best fit is also other subtle ways of saying who's in, who's out, right? So I don't have an answer for you because it's a very, very challenging question to even try to start to examine. But it does go back to those systems perspective of privilege and power that we've been talking about quite a bit. And I just want to acknowledge something Kyle said. He said it tongue in cheek, but I do kind of agree with it. And I don't mean to be ageist in any way, but there is an aspect of some of these spaces around work needs to progress when some of those retirements happen, because some of those antiquated ways of knowledge are stalling some of the work around EDI if we're being fully open in this kind of a dialogue.
Thank you, Irfan. I'm mindful of our time. It's almost 1 p.m. Just a final question, maybe final thoughts here around building our collective capacity to achieve racial equity. How can we do that? If you have any final thoughts, anything you would like to share.
Maybe I'll just go first. I think it's about, I'll just say that for white folks, if and when you mess up, it's okay to keep coming back to this discussion, because white folks need more practice at being able to discuss and to work in this area. And when somebody kind of calls you in and cares enough about you or the future people that you'll meet to do this work in a respectful way, to really take that to heart, that somebody cares enough about you to help make your work better. So it can be hard and difficult, but that there's lots of resources out there to go and work from, and lots of initiatives and opportunity, particularly I think through the Center for Race and Culture's work as well as MacEwan's. Thank you so much. Kyle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to reiterate, and to not sound cheesy, but it all starts from within, right? And Irfan talked about this, Jennifer talked about this. The moment that you can sort of come to terms with your place in the world and how you contribute to stuff is really the moment that I think that you can move forward. Because I really think, we ask a lot of our institutions to hold themselves accountable and responsible and to understand their place, and they never do. So, I really think it does start from an individualistic level, and hopefully we can sort of establish, a bit more empathy and care that way from the bottom up, as opposed from the top down.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is the end of Roundtable. We are going to give you a 15-minute break. We won't be live on Facebook during our break. Give you time, we won't end the session, but feel free to leave and then use the same link to come back. After this session, we will have our keynote with Dr. Christopher Taylor, and please continue to use the Q&A if you have any questions for us. Thank you so much. Thanks, Irfan, Jennifer, and Kyle. Enjoy the rest of your day.